1944. The Iowa heat hung thick and heavy, the air smelling of fresh-cut hay. When the military truck door dropped, a line of German prisoners stepped onto the black soil. They were the enemy, taught to expect barbed wire and beatings. Instead, a quiet American farmer handed them work gloves and promised them a wage, 80 cents a day. One prisoner laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You earn money here? For losing?" They had been sent to kill American sons, but this father was about to write them a paycheck. On this farm, they weren't prisoners, they were employees. This is a story about a small act of decency that history almost forgot. If you believe these forgotten stories need to be told, hit that subscribe button. And let me know what city you're watching from. It's incredible to see where these histories find a home. The air in the county archive was thick with the scent of old paper and settled dust, a smell Lydia Bennett associated with secrets sleeping in manila folders. She ran a careful finger down a column of faded blue ink in a ledger brittle with age. German Prisoner Labor Payroll, 1944, the heading read. Beside it, a single, stark entry repeated down the page, 80 cents per man per day. It was a strange, forgotten piece of accounting from a war that felt more like myth than family history. But it was the photograph tucked inside the ledger that made her breath catch. There was her grandfather, Tom Bennett, a man she remembered as quiet and distant, his hands always smelling of soil and motor oil. He was standing in a sun-drenched field, and beside him, smiling, were three young men in the worn field-grey uniforms of the German Wehrmacht. They weren't monsters from a newsreel. They were just boys, their faces open and unguarded. And her grandfather, whose own son was buried in Italy, was smiling with them. The question bloomed in her mind, sharp and unsettling. Why was Grandpa smiling with the enemy? The memory wasn't hers, but it rose from the photograph like heat from summer asphalt. It was 1944, and the same Iowa sun that bleached the photo baked the black soil of the Bennett farm. A U.S. Army truck rumbled to a stop, its engine cutting out with a sigh, leaving a sudden, ringing silence. The tailgate dropped with a metallic clang, and a dozen German prisoners of war were ordered out. They were young, most of them barely out of their teens, with the gaunt, wary look of men who had lost everything but their own skin. They were Wehrmacht infantry, captured in the deserts of North Africa, now standing in the middle of America's heartland. They expected the worst. Propaganda had promised them cruel beasts and brutal guards. They braced for hostility, for beatings, for the gnawing hunger of a revenge they were told they deserved. Instead, Tom Bennett stepped forward. He wasn't a soldier, just a broad-shouldered man in denim overalls, his face a mask of quiet grief he had worn since the telegram about his son arrived from Anzio. He didn't shout, he didn't sneer, he held out a stack of canvas work gloves. His housekeeper, a widow named Mrs. Dean, followed with a tray of thick sandwiches and a bucket of cold water. A young army sergeant explained the terms. They would work the fields, and they would be paid 80 cents a day, credited to their accounts at the prisoner camp. The men stared, uncomprehending. One of them, a former mechanic from Berlin, named Erich Müller, let out a short, incredulous laugh. The sound was dry, like stones rattling in a tin can. "You earn money here?" he asked, his English rough but clear. "For losing?" A wave of uneasy laughter rippled through the other prisoners. It wasn't joyful, but it was a human sound, and in the suffocating quiet of their defeat, it felt like a crack in a wall, letting in a sliver of impossible light. They worked, they harvested beets and hoed corn under Tom's silent, watchful eye. He was a man hollowed out by loss, and every time he looked at these young Germans, he saw the ghost of the son they had taken from him. Yet, he was a farmer first, and a farmer respects honest work. These men were efficient. They didn't complain. As they worked, they hummed old songs from a life that no longer existed, their low melodies drifting over the fields. The air, thick with the scent of hay and the faint tang of diesel, carried their sorrowful tunes. At noon, Mrs. Dean brought them lemonade, her expression firm but not unkind. It was a simple gesture, but in a world built on hate, a glass of cold lemonade felt like a radical act of mercy. It was a language the prisoners understood better than English. That night, back in the sparse barracks of the Algona camp, Eric wrote a letter to his family, the words tumbling out in his astonishment. "They pay us," he wrote, the pencil scratching against the thin paper. "Not much, but it is fair. They call me Mr. The farmer, his son was killed in the fighting, but he does not hate us, as the papers said. They treat us like men." He folded the letter, a fragile seed of hope, taking root in the barren soil of his captivity. But hope was a dangerous currency. In the bunk next to him, another prisoner whispered in the dark, his voice laced with the cynicism of a man who had seen too much. "It's a trick," he hissed. "Propaganda. They will take pictures and show them to the world to prove how humane they are. Don't be a fool." The doubt settled in the air, cold and heavy. Weeks later, Tom was walking the fence line near the field where the prisoners were taking their midday break. He heard them talking, their German punctuated by laughter. He caught a few English words, mangled but clear. Yankee dollars. The phrase hit him like a physical blow. His son, his only child, was dead, and these men were laughing about earning American money on his land. A hot, familiar rage surged in his chest. His grief, usually a quiet, aching weight, roared to life. He was done. He would call the camp, tell them the arrangement was over, tell them to take these men and their quiet songs and their easy laughter and never bring them back. He turned, his jaw set, ready to walk back to the house and end it. But then he saw him. It had started to rain, a soft, grey drizzle that turned the dust to mud. The other prisoners had huddled under the sparse shade of an oak tree. But Eric was out in the open, his back to the others. A section of the barbed wire fence had come loose from its post. Without being asked, without anyone watching, Eric was methodically fixing it. He worked with a quiet, focused competence, his hands nimble as he rewrapped the wire, his movements economical and sure. He was a mechanic, a man who understood how things fit together, how to mend what was broken. He was doing it simply because it needed to be done. Tom stopped. The rain fell on both of them, one a grieving father, the other a captured soldier. The anger in Tom's chest didn't vanish, but it subsided, making way for something else, something he couldn't name. It was a flicker of recognition, a shared understanding of duty, of setting things right. In that silent moment, two men from opposite ends of the earth, separated by a war that had taken everything from them, saw not an enemy, but simply another man trying to hold his small corner of the world together. The rest of the fence, however, stretched on for miles, its barbs glinting in the rain like an unhealed scar. The late summer weeks settled into a rhythm, marked by the rising sun and the rumble of the army truck arriving each morning. The suspicion that had coated the first few days began to wear away, eroded by shared labor and small, unspoken kindnesses. The German prisoners proved to be exactly what Tom Bennett needed, hard-working men who understood the land. They worked with a quiet diligence, their movements economical, their focus absolute. A fragile trust began to sprout in the spaces between the rows of corn. Eric, with his mechanic's mind and an ear for patterns, started to pick up English. He learned the words for tools from Tom's gruff, one-word instructions: wrench, shovel, water. And he learned the language of grace from the Bible verses Mrs. Dean would quietly read on the porch during their midday break. The words were simple, but they landed in him like seeds. One afternoon, as they were loading beets onto the flatbed, Eric paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a gloved hand. He looked at Tom, who was silently inspecting the truck's tires. The question had been sitting in his chest for weeks, a puzzle he couldn't solve. "Mr. Bennett," he began, his voice hesitant, "why do you pay us?" Tom stopped his work and looked at the young man, his eyes betraying nothing. He could have given the simple answer, the one the army provided, but he didn't. He took a long breath, the air thick with the sweet, earthy smell of the harvest. "Because we're supposed to," he said, his voice low and even. "Geneva says so." He paused, then added the part that was his own, the part that mattered. "But also, because it's right. A man does a day's work, he gets a day's pay. Doesn't matter what uniform he wears." He turned back to the tire, the conversation over. But for Eric, it was a revelation. It wasn't propaganda. It was a principle, a quiet moral code held by a man who had every reason to hate him. The harmony of the farm reached its peak as the main harvest season arrived. The fields were golden, the air was crisp, and the work was relentless. Then, the tractor sputtered, coughed a plume of black smoke, and died. Tom, a capable mechanic himself, spent half a day tinkering with the engine, his frustration mounting with every failed attempt to restart it. The harvest couldn't wait. As Tom stood there, grease on his hands and defeat settling on his shoulders, Eric stepped forward. He spoke quietly to the guard, then to Tom, explaining in his careful English that he had been a mechanic in Berlin. He knew engines. With a skeptical nod, Tom waved him toward the tractor. For the next hour, Eric worked with a surgeon's precision, his hands moving with an innate understanding of machinery. He diagnosed the problem, found a piece of scrap metal in the barn, and fashioned a replacement part with a file and a hammer. When he finally wiped his hands and told Tom to try again, the engine turned over with a powerful, healthy roar. A cheer went up from the other prisoners. For the first time, genuine laughter filled the air, free of bitterness or irony. That afternoon, the work felt different. It felt like a shared victory. They broke for lunch under the wide sky, and Mrs. Dean brought out a freshly baked apple pie. Tom tuned the small radio in the barn to a station playing Glenn Miller, the smooth, optimistic swing of the music, a soundtrack to a piece that should have been impossible. For a fleeting, perfect moment, they weren't enemies or captors and prisoners. They were just men, sharing bread and music at the end of a hard day's work. When the pay ledger was signed that evening, Tom quietly added an extra 10 cents to each man's pay. Next to the entry, he wrote 2 words: for honesty. But their small sanctuary was not invisible. Word had spread through the nearby town that Tom Bennett was not just working German POWs, he was treating them well. A local patriot group, their grief and anger fueled by headlines from the front, saw it as a betrayal. Accusations began to circulate that Tom was coddling the enemy, that he was forgetting his own son's sacrifice. The pressure mounted, a low, ugly hum on the edge of their peaceful days. Then, the system itself turned against them. The sympathetic sergeant who had accompanied the men each day was reassigned. His replacement was a new guard, a man with hard eyes and a permanent sneer, who saw the prisoners not as men, but as objects of contempt. He barked orders, his voice dripping with venom, forbidding them to speak German or to accept anything from Mrs. Dean. The fragile peace shattered a few days later. The new guard, seeking to assert his dominance, struck one of the older prisoners across the face with the back of his hand for not working fast enough. The man stumbled, his lips split and bleeding. Before anyone could react, Eric stepped between them, his body a shield. He didn't raise his voice or his fists. He just stood there, a silent refusal. "He is an old man," Eric said, his voice shaking with a cold fury. The guard, enraged by the defiance, raised his hand again, this time toward Eric. Just as he swung, Tom intervened, grabbing the guard's arm. "That's enough," Tom said, his voice a low growl. The guard ripped his arm free and, in a blind flash of rage, struck Tom across the jaw. The blow sent Tom staggering back. The line had been crossed, the sanctuary had been violated. The next morning, the truck didn't come. An officer from the camp arrived instead, informing Tom that, due to the incident, his contract for prisoner labor was terminated, effective immediately. There was no discussion, no appeal. The farm gates, which had been a passage to a fragile kind of freedom, were now closed. The system had reasserted its control. That evening, Tom Bennett stood alone at the edge of his field. The harvest was only half done. The rows of unpicked corn stood like silent soldiers, their husks rustling in the wind. He looked toward the fence that Eric had mended, the same fence where he had first felt a crack in his own bitterness. Now, the wind moaned through the empty posts, a lonely, mournful sound that spoke of broken trust and a peace that had been lost as quickly as it was found. Winter arrived, draping the Iowa landscape in a shroud of white. The silence that had fallen over the Bennett farm grew deeper, colder. The corn remained unharvested in the fields, a frozen monument to the broken arrangement. Inside the prisoner of war camp, the mood was equally grim. The brief interlude of purpose and dignity was gone, replaced by the crushing monotony of confinement. Eric Mueller grew thinner, his quiet optimism eroded by the long, idle days. In the spring of 1945, news of the war's end trickled into the camp, not with a triumphant roar, but with a weary, hollow echo. Germany was in ruins. The men who had been soldiers were now just the defeated, their futures as uncertain as the smoke rising from their burned-out cities. A few weeks later, a letter arrived for Eric from the Red Cross. He read it standing by the barbed wire fence, his hands trembling. His home in Berlin was gone. His father's bakery, the heart of their family for 3 generations, had been reduced to rubble. The news didn't bring tears. He was too numb for that. It was just another loss in a litany of losses. But he still had one thing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. On it, written in the neat, careful pencil script of a man who measured twice and cut once, was Tom Bennett's address. It was a fragile link to a time when he had been treated not as a number, but as a man. 75 years later, Lydia Bennet sat at her grandfather's old wooden desk, the same one he had used to calculate payrolls and order seeds. The house was quiet, filled with the ghosts of a life she was only just beginning to understand. Tucked away in a small metal box where Tom had kept important papers, she found the note. The pencil was faded, but the address was still legible, and beneath it, in a small envelope, yellowed with age, was a collection of coins. A simple tag, written in her grandfather's hand, was tied to it with a piece of twine. It read, Eric M., wages unpaid. It was the bonus, the 10 cents for honesty. Her grandfather had kept it all these years, a debt he felt he still owed. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the man she had never truly known. It was a testament to a connection that had somehow endured across decades of silence. The war hadn't ended for her grandfather on VE Day. A piece of it had lived on in this small, quiet act of remembrance. In 1946, Erich Müller was finally repatriated to a Germany he no longer recognized. He returned not to Berlin, but to Hamburg, where some distant relatives had taken refuge. The city was a landscape of ghosts, of hollowed-out buildings, and hungry people. But Erich was a mechanic, a builder. He knew how to make things work. He used the small sum of money he had earned in America, the 80 cents a day that had once seemed like a joke, and bought flour. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He found a small bombed-out shop, and with his own hands, rebuilt the ovens. He began to bake bread, and he wrote a letter. He poured onto the page everything he couldn't say in his broken English, his gratitude, his astonishment at the decency he had been shown, his hope for a future where men could be judged by the work of their hands rather than the flag on their uniform. You paid me for work I would have done for bread, he wrote to Tom. That small act changed what I believed about your country and about what was possible between men. I used those coins to buy flour. My father's bakery lives again. He signed the letter, and at the bottom, drew a small, proud sketch of his new shop sign. It read, Bennett Brot, Bennett's Bread. He mailed the letter, a message of hope sent out into a broken world. But the world was still mending, and its scars were deep. The letter, passing through the hands of U.S. military censors wary of fraternization, was deemed inappropriate. It was never delivered. It was filed away, a conversation cut short, a bridge left unfinished. Until Lydia found it, nearly 80 years later, tucked into a dusty archive box labeled Intercepted Mail. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Lydia traveled to Hamburg the following spring. The city was vibrant and modern, but history was everywhere if you knew where to look. She found the bakery in a quiet, cobblestone side street. The sign above the door was new, but the name was the same, Bennett Brot. Inside, the smell of fresh bread was warm and inviting. An old framed photograph hung on the wall. It was a different one from the ledger, but the subjects were the same. A younger Tom Bennett and a smiling Erich Müller, standing together in an Iowa cornfield, two men from two different worlds, forever linked by a season of shared work. A young man who looked remarkably like Erich came to the counter. He saw Lydia looking at the photo and then at her, his eyes curious. "Can I help you?" he asked in German. Lydia answered in English, her voice a little unsteady. "My name is Lydia Bennet." The baker's eyes widened in recognition. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "Ah," he said, switching to perfect English. "Bennet, you are from the farm that paid my grandfather like a man." He disappeared into the back and returned a moment later with a warm loaf of bread, its crust a perfect golden brown. He handed it to her, a simple, profound offering. Stamped into the top of the loaf was a small, intricate seal, the same one from the sketch in the letter, an image of two hands shaking across a stalk of wheat. Honor through work. Lydia walked out of the bakery and into the bright morning light, the warmth of the loaf seeping into her hands. It was more than just bread. It was a promise kept, a debt paid, a story of mercy that had traveled across an ocean and through generations. A quiet reminder that the most powerful thing you can give another person is not charity, but dignity. The warmth of the bread in Lydia's hands was more than just heat from the oven. It was the warmth of a story come full circle. Eric's grandson, whose name was Klaus, stepped out from the bakery and stood beside her on the cobblestone street. He didn't ask for the story. He seemed to already know it, as if it were a part of his own DNA. He gestured to a small cafe across the street. an invitation that needed no words. Over coffee, he filled in the silent decades. He told her how his grandfather, Eric, had spoken of that Iowa summer not as a time of imprisonment, but as a time of profound education. It was where he learned that an enemy could have a human face, and that a nation's character was not found in its armies, but in its quietest corners, in the decency of a single farmer. Klaus explained that Eric struggled for years with the ghosts of the war, with the things he had seen and done, but the memory of Tom Bennett's farm was an anchor. It was proof that goodness could exist even in the heart of darkness. He had tried to find Tom again in the 60s, sending letters that were all returned, stamped with the indifferent words, "Addressee unknown." He never knew his first letter had been intercepted. He had simply assumed Tom had moved on, or perhaps had died, and the conversation was lost to time. Klaus then spoke of the bakery's motto, "Honor through work." It was not a marketing slogan, he explained, but a philosophy. His grandfather believed that honest labor was the great equalizer. It stripped away uniforms and politics, leaving only the integrity of the task at hand. It was the principle he had seen in Tom Bennett, a man who judged others not by their origins, but by their effort. It was the legacy he had built his new life upon, a legacy he passed down to his children and grandchildren. Before Lydia left, Klaus went into the back of the shop one last time. He returned with a small, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth. It was a well-worn ball-peen hammer, its wooden handle smooth and dark from years of use. "This was my grandfather's," Klaus said, placing it in her hands. It was the first tool he bought when he returned. He said it was the same kind of hammer the American farmer used to fix his machines. It was a simple, solid piece of steel and wood, a tool for building and mending. It felt like a baton being passed across a great distance. Lydia returned to Iowa, but the landscape was changed. Or rather, she was. The farm was no longer just a plot of land she had inherited. It was a historical site, a place of quiet pilgrimage. The fence line where Eric had made his silent repair was not just wire and wood, but a testament to a man's character. The fields were not just fields, but a stage where a quiet drama of compassion had unfolded against the vast, violent backdrop of a world war. Her work at the archive took on a new urgency. This story could not be allowed to sleep in a folder. It belonged to the community, to the world. It was a piece of their collective soul. She began to assemble an exhibit. At its center was the faded payroll ledger, open to the page, showing the 80 cents a day wage. Beside it, she placed the photograph of her grandfather smiling with the young German soldiers. On one side, she laid the intercepted letter from Eric, its message of gratitude finally delivered. On the other, the small envelope of coins, Tom's unpaid debt of honor. And in the middle of it all, resting on a bed of simple black velvet, was the German mechanic's hammer. The exhibit opened on a crisp autumn evening. The room was filled with people from the town, their faces illuminated by the soft gallery lights. They were the descendants of the farmers, the patriots, the soldiers who had lived through that time. They stood before the display in silence, reading the words, looking at the faces, touching a history that felt both distant and intimately familiar. Lydia watched them, and she saw the understanding dawning in their eyes. They were not just looking at a story about her grandfather and a German prisoner. They were looking at a story about themselves, about the quiet, often overlooked choices that define a person and a nation. An elderly man, whose father had been one of the most vocal critics of Tom's actions, stood before the display for a long time. He turned to Lydia, his eyes wet with emotion. "My father never understood," he said, his voice thick. He only saw the uniform. Lydia simply nodded, the loaf of Bennett brought sitting on a table in her own kitchen, a silent witness. The past was not a buried thing, it was a living root, and its branches were still reaching out, offering sustenance, connection, and the enduring hope that even across the deepest of divides, a bridge could be built, one small, decent act at a time.